In 1789, France was structured like a pyramid with a crushing weight at the bottom. At the very top, the first estate of the clergy and the second estate of the nobility owned a land, enjoyed the luxuries of Versailles, and paid practically nothing in taxes. Beneath them, millions of merchants, lawyers, and peasants making up the third estate carried the entire physical and financial burden of the empire. That fragile structure began to buckle under a severe bankruptcy crisis. King Louis XVI had drained the national treasury, and the cost of survival skyrocketed. A single loaf of bread suddenly cost a laborer an entire week of sweat and wages, while the monarchy remained completely isolated from the starvation happening in the streets. Desperation alone usually leads to easily crushed riots, but this time it was paired with a new intellectual framework. Enlightenment thinkers like Voltaire openly mocked the idea that kings ruled by divine right, while writers like Rousseau circulated the concept that political power actually belonged to the people. When you combine widespread starvation with the sudden belief that the social order is a human invention, the situation changes. Disorganized anger morphs into a focused, systemic threat aimed directly at the throne. King Louis called a meeting of the Estates General to fix his bankruptcy problem, expecting the Third Estate to simply foot the bill. Instead, they refused to bow. They broke away, declared themselves the National Assembly, and swore an oath on a Versailles tennis court that they would not leave until France had a written constitution. Then the political rebellion turned physical. On July 14th, a furious Parisian mob stormed the Bastille, an ancient fortress and prison that stood as a literal monument to royal tyranny. They tore the building apart stone by stone and paraded the governor's severed head through the streets. With the old order structurally broken, the revolutionaries drafted the Declaration of the Rights of Man. Looking at this document, we see the Enlightenment philosophies explicitly written into the legal framework of the new republic, legally asserting that liberty, equality, and fraternity belong to everyone. But this created a fatal tension right at the birth of the republic. The revolutionaries were attempting to build a highly rational, elegant utopia, using the unchecked, unpredictable violence of public rage as their primary tool. The physical balance of power shifted completely when the Women's March descended on Versailles. Thousands of angry, armed citizens dragged the royal family back to Paris, effectively rendering King Louis a prisoner to the whims of the crowd. With the king sidelined, a massive power vacuum opened up. On one side were the moderate Girondins, who wanted to stabilize the government and build something balanced. On the other side were the Jacobins, a radical faction willing to harness the crowd's fury to push the revolution to its absolute limits. The Jacobins were led by Maximilien Robespierre, a man known for being cold and entirely incorruptible. Robespierre held a deeply lethal paradox. He genuinely believed he was creating a pure republic of virtue, but he was convinced the only way to achieve it was by executing anyone who disagreed with his vision. Governing a volatile, starving populace requires control. To maintain order, the revolution permanently shelved its elegant philosophies of universal rights, replacing them with a brutal, paranoid pragmatism where violence became the primary tool of statecraft. In 1793, Louis XVI was sent to the guillotine. That falling blade acted as a point of no return, plunging France into massive external wars with the nervous monarchies of Europe, while simultaneously triggering a vicious civil war inside its own borders. This chart shows the escalating death toll of the Reign of Terror. Executions started with aristocrats and priests, but numbers swelled over time. Counter-revolutionaries, peasants, and commoners were caught in the dragnet, resulting in an estimated 40,000 dead. The bloodshed spiraled so far out of control that the target list inevitably reached the revolutionaries themselves. Even Robespierre's closest political allies realized that the man leading the charge had become the exact type of absolute tyrant they had sworn to destroy. On the date known as 9 Thermidor, the government finally turned on him. Robespierre was arrested mid-speech, his jaw shattered by a pistol shot. The very next morning, he was sent to the exact same guillotine he had spent 2 years feeding with his enemies. The revolution's demand for absolute ideological purity had stripped away its humanity. It evolved into a highly efficient mechanical monster that ultimately devoured its own architects. What rose from the ashes of the terror was a profoundly exhausted society. The new ruling government, the Directory, was heavily corrupt and deeply unpopular, with a population that was now craving stability far more than political liberty. That deep societal fatigue created the perfect shape for a military dictator to step into. A young Corsican general named Napoleon Bonaparte seized power in a coup, offering the order France desperately wanted, and functionally bringing the chaotic republic to an end. It looks like a complete failure. A revolution designed to kill a king ended with an emperor. But Napoleon's dictatorship could not uninvent the Enlightenment ideals the revolution had unleashed. You can execute a leader, but you cannot execute the realization that kings are just men. The concepts that ordinary people possess inherent human rights and that deeply entrenched oppressive systems can actually be torn down were permanently introduced into the global consciousness. Those ideas could never be put back in the bottle. They crossed oceans and borders, echoing through every major uprising that followed, from Latin America to Haiti, straight through to the modern democratic world. The events of 1789 were incredibly violent, but they provided the necessary blood-soaked blueprint for the world we live in today.